The message to Africa has echoed for generations: challenge the West and pay with your life. It was the fate of Patrice Lumumba, cut down after only 67 days in power. It was the fate of Thomas Sankara, silenced after 4 short years. And it was the fate of Muammar Gaddafi, whose dream of a united African currency was buried beneath the rubble of NATO bombs. The lesson was carved into African soil with blood: defy and you die. Yet, in the very heart of the Sahel, where poverty collides with gold, and where terror has turned entire provinces into ghostlands, a young soldier has chosen to climb the same perilous mountain. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, 34 years old, unknown yesterday, head of state today. Some call him the youngest revolutionary of our time, others call him reckless. But no one can deny this: his defiance has set Africa's political map ablaze. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history may never forget. Subscribe and stand with the story. Burkina Faso in the 2010s was a nation caught in a cruel paradox: rich in soil, but poor in life. Beneath its red earth lay veins of gold, shimmering in the dark like promises of prosperity. More than 60 tons were pulled from the ground each year by 2020, yet the hands that dug them remained calloused with hunger. The gold traveled north, flowing through companies such as Endeavor Mining and Orazone Gold Corporation, while the people living above these riches struggled to find clean water. Life expectancy lingered at 61 years. Barely more than a third of the population had access to safe drinking water. On the United Nations Human Development Index, Burkina Faso stood at 182 out of 189. It was a nation stripped of dignity while its soil glittered for others. Into this landscape stepped a young officer, Ibrahim Traoré. Stationed in the troubled north, he watched as foreign military advisors dictated strategies for Burkina territory, strategies that often seemed less about saving lives and more about guarding gold. He saw intelligence withheld, resources diverted, and local commanders sidelined in their own homeland. To him and many of his peers, the message was clear: sovereignty was still an illusion, wrapped in the language of aid and cooperation. The illusion began to unravel in 2015 when waves of terror crashed across the Sahel. After NATO's destruction of Libya, weapons flooded south, arming militant groups who carved chaos into Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. The first brutal shock came in January 2016, when gunmen stormed the splendid hotel in Ouagadougou. 30 lives were taken, and a message was sent: nowhere was safe. Over the years that followed, schools emptied, markets turned silent, and whole regions became no-go zones. Displacement camps swelled with families who had lost everything but their will to endure. As captain, Traoré fought on these front lines. He buried comrades, comforted widows, and saw his people bleed while foreign forces seemed more concerned with protecting mining sites than with defending villages. To him, this was not security. It was servitude disguised in uniform. In 2015, President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore came to power promising stability. He followed the prescriptions of foreign partners: reforms, aid programs, and cooperation agreements. But reality only grew harsher. Attacks multiplied, the economy stagnated, and frustration spilled into the streets. By 2021, protests erupted demanding Kabore's resignation. The soldiers, watching from the barracks and the battlefield, saw a president who bowed more readily to foreign ambassadors than to his own citizens. The breaking point arrived in January 2022. Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba overthrew Kabore in a coup, vowing to restore security and dignity. At first, Traoré and other young officers believed perhaps this time a leader would put Burkina Faso first. But hope turned to disillusion. Damiba walked the same path. Foreign advisors in strategy meetings, foreign aid with hidden strings, foreign interests cloaked as partnership. 8 months later, nothing had changed. Then came the moment that altered everything. In late September 2022, Traoré sat in a briefing where Damiba once again deferred to French military advisors over Burkina territory. For Traoré, It was the final betrayal, a scene replayed too many times in African history. That night, he gathered his fellow officers, men who had lost friends in battles that served others. Together, they resolved to cut the strings, even if it meant facing the storm. By dawn on September the 30th, gunfire rattled the capital. Explosions echoed near the presidential palace. Hours later, a calm but firm voice spoke on national television. Paul-Henri Damiba had been overthrown. In his place stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, aged just 34, the youngest head of state in the world. But more than titles, more than youth, it was what he symbolized that shook the continent. In his first statements, he did not look outward for validation. He did not seek recognition from Paris, Brussels, or Washington. Instead, he addressed his people directly. He promised them not aid, but dignity, not dependency, but sovereignty. This was not merely another coup in the Sahel. It was the ignition of a larger struggle, a confrontation between Africa's desire to reclaim its soil and the weight of foreign chains. And as the dust settled in Ouagadougou, one question hung heavy in the air. Would this young soldier succeed where so many before him had fallen? The coup of September 2022 was not loud, but it was seismic. In a matter of hours, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had toppled a government and sent ripples far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. At 34, the world's youngest head of state stood before the cameras, not as a supplicant to foreign capitals, but as a son of his soil declaring that the era of submission was over. The symbolism deepened within weeks. In December 2022, Traoré demanded the withdrawal of all French forces from Burkina Faso. For decades, French troops had been both the shield and the shadow of the nation, a presence that reassured foreign investors while reminding Burkinab citizens that they were never fully sovereign. By expelling them, Traoré was cutting a cord that had bound his country since independence. For many in Ouagadougou, it was a moment that felt like breathing clean air after years of suffocation. Crowds flooded the streets, waving national flags, chanting his name. But the significance went further. Across the Sahel, his defiance was contagious. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta spoke of sovereignty with new fire. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani began questioning uranium deals that favored France while leaving Nigerians poor. In village squares, university halls, and bustling marketplaces, the language of dignity replaced the language of dependency. The image of Traoré, young, defiant, unapologetic, became a banner for a new generation. On the continental stage, he became the main event. At Pan-African conferences, his presence drew standing ovations. His words, sharp, rhythmic, unapologetic, echoed the spirit of Thomas Sankara while pointing to a 21st century revolution. He declared that African nations did not need lectures about democracy from those who had enriched themselves by plundering African soil. He insisted that security should not be outsourced, that development must not be dictated, and that dignity was not negotiable. The reaction from the West was swift and predictable. European think tanks published reports warning of a contagion effect, the fear that Traoré's defiance might spread across the continent. American officials, in private, spoke of the need to contain his influence before it reached larger states. International organizations raised alarms about democratic backsliding and authoritarian tendencies. Sanctions soon followed. Targeted restrictions against Burkinab officials, travel bans, frozen assets. The media campaign was perhaps the sharpest weapon. Western outlets painted Traoré as just another African strongman, a populist cloaking ambition in anti-colonial rhetoric. Headlines focused on the extension of military rule until 2029, rarely explaining the context of insecurity, displacement, and weak institutions. Reports dwelled on human rights concerns, while ignoring the decades of exploitation that had hollowed out Burkina Faso's democracy. To many in Africa, this bias was not invisible. It was infuriating. And so every condemnation, every sanction, every headline seemed to reinforce Traoré's point. If the West was so desperate to discredit him, Surely it was because he was threatening something larger than Burkina Faso alone. He called the sanctions economic terrorism and transformed them into rallying cries. When aid was cut, he declared that African problems must be solved with African solutions. When diplomatic isolation grew, he deepened ties with Russia, China, and Iran. Nations willing to provide security and infrastructure without the constant lectures of former colonizers. On the ground in Burkina Faso, the reaction was raw, visceral, and electric. For the first time in decades, many ordinary citizens felt that their leader was speaking with their voice. His speeches were broadcast in villages where politics had once been only a distant echo. He invoked ancestors, reminded his people of the empires they had built before colonial borders, and urged them to believe in their own capacity to create prosperity. For a population long denied agency, his words felt like light breaking through a closed sky. Yet the applause and adoration carried a weight. Traoré was no longer just the president of a landlocked nation of 22 million. He had become the embodiment of an awakening across Africa. His triumphs were continental triumphs. His failures would be continental wounds. And as the cheers grew louder, so too did the pressure. Because revolutions do not rest on speeches alone. They are tested by hunger, by bullets, by the long nights when ideals must wrestle with reality. And even as Traoré basked in the fervor of support, the storms of violence and poverty were gathering strength just beyond the applause. Would his defiance carve a new road for Africa? Or would it collapse beneath the same weight that crushed those before him? The glow of revolution quickly collided with the grit of reality. By the end of 2022, Burkina Faso was already carrying wounds too deep to heal overnight. The terrorists who haunted its villages did not retreat simply because French troops had departed. Instead, attacks multiplied. The figures were grim. More than 3,600 Burkinab killed in 2022, rising to over 6,300 by 2024. Whole provinces in the north and east remained under militant control, no-go zones where the state existed only as a memory. The displacement crisis swelled beyond imagination. More than 2 million people, nearly 1 in every 10 Burkinab, fled their homes. Schools shuttered as teachers abandoned posts. Clinics closed when health workers could no longer operate safely. For children in the camps, education was a distant dream. For mothers, clean water and food became battles fought daily. The revolution promised dignity, but for many families, survival was the immediate horizon. Economic challenges compounded the pain. Though the government began renegotiating mining contracts and establishing processing facilities, the economy still leaned heavily on raw gold exports and a handful of crops. Nationalist speeches did not erase global markets, nor did they fill empty stomachs. Foreign investment dried up under sanctions. Roads and bridges projects stalled. Youth unemployment remained stubbornly high, fueling frustration among the very generation that had cheered most loudly for change. A more subtle but equally dangerous trend emerged: the brain drain. Skilled Burkinab engineers, doctors, and teachers began leaving for safer and more prosperous neighboring countries. They did not abandon pride in the revolution, but pride alone could not compete with higher salaries and functioning hospitals abroad. It was an exodus that hollowed out the very capacity needed to rebuild the nation. Inside Burkina Faso, debates grew sharper. Supporters of Traoré framed these hardships as the unavoidable price of independence. They argued that breaking chains is never painless. To them, the rising death toll and economic strain were proof of authenticity. Evidence that the system was truly being shaken, rather than merely reshuffled. If transformation were easy, they reasoned, then Sankara or others before him would have completed it. Critics, however, saw betrayal in the gap between promise and practice. They accused Traoré of prolonging military rule not for stability, but for power. They pointed to the extension of the transition period until 2029 as proof of authoritarian drift. They argued that in casting out Western partners too abruptly, the government had left the country vulnerable, replacing one form of dependency with another, whether Russian arms, Chinese infrastructure, or Iranian agriculture. Sovereignty, they said, was still incomplete. And yet, even among skeptics, a grudging respect lingered. Few denied the courage it took to defy Paris and Washington, to risk sanctions and isolation. Fewer still denied the sincerity in his words when he spoke of dignity and pride. But the question loomed: could speeches alone sustain a nation bleeding daily? This tension defined what many began to call the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. Was his legacy to be remembered as the leader who sparked a continental awakening, inspiring millions with courage even if his country bore unbearable costs? Or would it be judged as the reckless gamble of a young captain whose defiance deepened suffering without delivering true liberation? Civil society groups wrestled with these questions. Some rallied behind him, using his speeches as blueprints for grassroots initiatives in education, agriculture, and local governance. Others pressed harder for accountability, demanding timelines, benchmarks, and transparency. Religious leaders prayed for wisdom to balance defiance with compassion. Meanwhile, the streets of Ouagadougou told their own story. Markets bustled with daily trade, yet prices climbed. Young men debated politics on corners, half hopeful, half cynical. Mothers carried children through camps where aid was scarce, but pride was not. The struggle for sovereignty was no longer an abstract idea. It was felt in empty bowls, in silent classrooms, in the tension between faith and fatigue. And always, the unspoken question hovered: would these sacrifices bloom into harvest, or were they simply seeds scattered on rocky ground? From the moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré took power, Burkina Faso ceased to be a local story. His defiance reverberated in chancelleries from Brussels to Washington, and every move was weighed not only as domestic policy, but as a geopolitical signal. The most visible shift was the recalibration of alliances. With French troops expelled, Russian advisors arrived in Ouagadougou to provide training and equipment. Chinese companies won contracts for infrastructure projects that had once been reserved for European firms. Iranian specialists offered expertise in agriculture and food processing. Traoré framed these partnerships not as replacements for old masters, but as proof of a new principle. Burkina Faso would work with any country that respected sovereignty. It was a message that struck chords far beyond his borders. Yet Western capitals saw something more alarming. To them, Burkina Faso under Traoré was a node in a growing anti-Western bloc stretching across the Sahel. European think tanks warned of a Sahel Alliance contagion. American officials spoke privately of the need to limit his influence before it spread south and east. The European Union imposed targeted sanctions on Burkina officials, joining earlier restrictions on Mali and Niger. Diplomatic pressure intensified. At United Nations forums, Burkina envoys refused to echo Western talking points, instead challenging the very framing of Africa's struggles. Where others spoke of aid dependency, they spoke of resource sovereignty. Where others emphasized governance reforms, they emphasized the legacy of exploitation. It was a defiant, unapologetic stance, and it earned Traoré both admiration and enemies. Media narratives followed familiar lines. Western outlets dwelled on democratic backsliding, human rights concerns, and the extension of military rule until 2029. Rarely did they note the context of insecurity, displacement, and institutional fragility that underpinned his decision. African audiences, however, read between the lines. They saw not impartial reporting, but a continuation of double standards that had long painted African defiance as dangerous while overlooking the structural causes of instability. Meanwhile, regional organizations faced dilemmas. ECOWAS threatened sanctions, but found its credibility weakened as more member states drifted toward the Sahel Alliance. The African Union struggled to balance its principles of constitutional order with the rising tide of anti-colonial sentiment among its members. For many ordinary Africans, the choice was clear. They sided with the leader who dared to speak what they had long whispered. At home, Traoré cast his long horizon in bold terms. He spoke not of quick fixes, but of transformation measured in decades. He linked today's hardships to tomorrow's sovereignty, insisting that only by enduring present struggles could Burkina Faso stand tall by mid-century. It was in these moments that his rhetoric touched on what supporters began to call the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a vision of a nation free from dependency, integrated into a self-reliant Africa, and proud of its place in the world. But visions collide with realities. For every supporter inspired by his words, there were critics abroad who saw danger, and critics at home who saw delay. And as the global spotlight grew harsher, one question sharpened. Would the world accept a Burkina Faso charting its own course, or would the pressures of isolation break the young revolution? The revolution in Burkina Faso stands at a fragile crossroads. For some, it is the dawn of a new Africa, sovereign, proud, unchained. For others, it is a perilous gamble whose costs are already written in blood and hunger. But one truth is undeniable. The decisions made in Ouagadougou today will echo far beyond its borders tomorrow. Traoré has framed the path ahead as both sacrifice and promise. His government has begun to reshape mining contracts, expand agricultural self-reliance, and lay the groundwork for value-added industries. The message is clear. Burkina Faso must no longer be the land where gold leaves and poverty stays. Yet economic restructuring is slow, and the weight of sanctions remains heavy. For citizens queuing for food or waiting for schools to reopen, promises of long-term prosperity can feel distant. Security remains the other great frontier. Without stability in the north and east, no revolution can hold. Traoré insists that Burkinab forces, trained with new allies, will secure the soil themselves. The expulsion of French troops symbolized independence, but it also left gaps that have yet to be fully filled. Terrorist groups exploit these voids, and for villagers in conflict zones, sovereignty can feel abstract when daily life is defined by fear. Yet even in hardship, the sense of awakening is real. The Sahel Alliance with Mali and Niger signals a future where African nations cooperate not as subjects of external powers, but as equals bound by shared struggle. Joint operations, intelligence sharing, and economic integration are small steps, but they point to the possibility of a regional bloc strong enough to resist external dictates. If such cooperation endures, the seeds of sovereignty planted in the Sahel may one day grow into a continental harvest. But the risks are equally stark. Isolation from global finance, over-reliance on new external patrons, and the constant threat of internal dissent could all weaken the revolution before it matures. Traoré himself knows the stakes. In speeches, he warns that revolutions are not clean. They are messy, painful, and often misunderstood. He asks his people to endure now so that their children may inherit dignity tomorrow. For the Burkinab people, the road ahead is both burden and blessing. To walk it requires patience, sacrifice, and resilience. To abandon it would mean returning to a cycle of dependency that generations have already endured. The question is whether this small, landlocked nation can carry such a heavy torch for an entire continent. And so the world watches, wondering whether Burkina Faso will stumble under its weight, or whether, against all odds, it will stride forward and light the path for Africa's future. In the story of Burkina Faso, the threads of history and hope are tightly woven. For decades, the nation has been trapped in the paradox of wealth beneath the ground and poverty above it. The arrival of Captain Ibrahim Traoré tore at that fabric, refusing to accept the pattern of dependency that had claimed so many leaders before him. His rise was not only a transfer of power, but a declaration that Africa need not bow forever. The revolution he sparked is not tidy. It is marred by blood, displacement, and hardship. Yet revolutions rarely unfold on smooth roads. They stumble, they bleed, and they test the faith of those who believe. Traoré reminds his people that true change is not measured in months or even years, but in generations. And it is within that span that his leadership will ultimately be judged. Supporters already speak of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. To them, he will be remembered as the man who defied the West and inspired millions across the continent to reclaim dignity. Critics argue that his legacy may prove hollow, a bold spark that flared but failed to bring warmth to his people. But whichever way history tilts, it is clear that his name has altered the conversation about Africa's future. At the same time, his Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050 offers a horizon beyond the immediate storm. It imagines a Burkina Faso that is sovereign, self-reliant, and deeply integrated into an Africa confident in its destiny. Whether that vision becomes reality or remains aspiration depends not only on his leadership, but on the will of a people who must walk the long road beside him. The verdict has not yet been written. Perhaps the hardships endured today will one day be remembered as the necessary price of freedom. Perhaps they will be remembered as the weight that crushed a dream. But one truth cannot be erased. This revolution has already shifted the axis of African politics. And so we leave with a question for you. If one small, landlocked nation can raise its voice and defy centuries of control, what stops the rest of a continent from doing the same? If you believe this story matters, do not look away. Subscribe, comment, and share. Because the struggle for dignity is not just Burkina Faso's, it is Africa's, and it belongs to all who dream of freedom.